Welcome to our Ponderful Webinar. This will be the last webinar of this year. I will record the session if it's okay for everybody, because we usually upload them on YouTube for people to watch later if they want.
I do have some. I'm going to wear an orange.
I will ask you during the presentation to mute yourself so everybody can hear the presentation well. And today we have Dr. Pascale from the Freshwater Habitats Trust. FHT is also a Ponderful partner, so it's very good to have her here. Dr. Pascale is also a CEO of Newt Conservation Partnership, and she has extensive experience of wetland, plant, and macroinvertebrate surveys, ecological assessments and monitoring, pond creation and management, and catchment management. That is what we are going to hear today. And she works closely with partners and landowners on practical pond creation in UK, and has a focus on ponds and floodplain wetland creation. So thank you so much, Pascale, for accepting this invitation. It's very good to have you here. I think all of people are very interested in this subject because we are with a lot of people joining this webinar today. So I will ask you, for everyone who has questions, put them in the chat, and at the end we have a discussion about the subject, and we will try to answer all of your questions. Pascale, you can start if you want.
Okay, thank you very much, Marissa. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm going to talk to you about this. I think, sorry, this. Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I can hear. No, that's fine. Right. Good afternoon. I'm going to talk to you about creating clean water ponds for freshwater wildlife.
Out there, take advantage as much as you can.
So this is what I'm going to talk about. Now, obviously, in an hour, as you can imagine, this is going to be a whistle-stop tour of pond creation. So we're going to have a short introduction about the importance of pond creation and ponds. We're going to discuss the key principle, the things you really have to understand in order to create some good ponds, the basic principle of designing scheme, and then some practical consideration. So just to reiterate, the focus of this is really wild ponds creating for freshwater wildlife. And of course, because I'm based in the UK, I'm going to show you some UK case studies. So I'm not covering new ponds for other ecosystem services, for example, sustainable urban drainage or irrigation or sedimentation pond. I'm not going to cover any of that. But of course, some of this principle can be applied to these ponds as well. So I've drawn on case studies from a range of projects, but mainly from the Million Ponds Project, which is a partnership project between Freshwater Habitats Trust, Amphibian Reptile Conservation Trust, where we created over 1,000 ponds for priority species in England and Wales. And then more recent example from the Newt Conservation Partnership. This organization create and restore habitat for great crested newt as part of the UK district licensing scheme, a specific scheme that is run by Nature Space Partnership. So example from different kind of projects. To start with, there is quite a lot of information on wildlife ponds generally, and which include also pond creation. So you've got the pond creation toolkit here. These are fact sheets that you can download from our website. It's all free, and it has lots of case studies, information about specific species, and also has all the principle. The pond book. More recently, we've published with UCL the Guide to the Restoration, Creation and Management of Ponds, which is aimed at farmers and practitioners. So this was just published a few months ago. So I would encourage you to, again, it's free to download from our website. And of course, our partners, Amphibian Reptile Conservation Trust, have an amphibian habitat management handbook for those that want a bit more on that. So let's start with the basics. which are the definition of a pond. There are many definitions. So I've used the UK definition, which is that a pond is a seasonal or permanent water body between 25 meters squares and 2 hectares that holds water for at least 3 months of the year. As you can see, this is very broad, and it includes the whole spectrum from very small ponds to effectively small lakes. 2 hectares is already a decent size. It also includes temporary ponds, and it also includes wetland scrapes, so that are created specifically for birds. So a pond is really, they are very diverse. A pondscape is simply a network of ponds that are functionally related. So again, it could be a relatively small site, or it could be an entire landscape. So there are many types of ponds, and all of them can be excellent for wildlife. So again, I've put in the temporary pond here because this is often what people forget. A farm pond that was just finished. We've lost a lot of our farm ponds, but there are still some that remains as well. A trefoil pool in the New Forest. This is an exceptionally good freshwater habitat, particularly for invertebrates. I mentioned already the wetland bird scrapes, which are effectively temporary ponds. Woodland ponds are also very good. And of course, you have wetland mosaics, which is effectively a group of ponds on wetlands. This is one of the schemes we did on the River Tame floodplain with our partner, the River Tame Trust, and this was during the actual construction. So very broad in terms of the different types of pond that you can find. And of course, it's widely recognized that ponds are a critical habitat for wildlife. In the UK, 2/3 of freshwater species live in ponds, and of course, that includes many sensitive species of plants and animals. 10% of priority species in the UK live in or are associated with ponds. So that includes the birds, the bats. But if you think about it, all animals need water. So of course, there are many more species that rely on ponds, but not as actively. Bats drink from ponds. And of course, with all the invertebrates that come out of ponds, mosquitoes and the like, then they have also a food source. What's really important about ponds is that the landscape scale, they provide a lot of diversity, gamma diversity. They're a great contributor of gamma diversity, and I'll show you some data on this in a second. So I've just illustrated that with a few of the animals and plants that we work with, but of course there are hundreds of plants and animals that rely on ponds, if not thousands. Right, so this is just an overview of a study, just to show how important ponds are at the landscape scale. This is a study that took place in central England, where all the water bodies in a particular area were surveyed. The same number of river sites, ponds, lakes, streams, and ditches. And a compatible method was used to be able to compare the different habitat type at the landscape scale. And what we found is that the ponds supported more species of plants and animals than the other water body types. They also supported many more uncommon plants. And this really showed the importance of ponds at the landscape scale. It's not just the individual water bodies that are important, it's all of them together. And that's very important when developing pond scheme, because you need to look beyond the one ponds. So this is really important study. It was the first of its kind, and it's been repeated in many European countries and in many parts of the UK now, and the pattern is always the same. It's actually quite uncanny. So really, pond creation, there's a bigger picture to this. This more important than just digging a little hole in the ground. We've lost about 50% of the ponds we had in the UK and indeed in Europe since the beginning of the 20th century. And this estimation probably underestimates the amount of ponds that were lost, because they probably don't take into account all the small puddles and ponds and temporary ponds that are much harder to estimate. So by creating ponds, we can effectively try and restore the pond number. Hence, this project we had called the Million Ponds Project. It's estimated we have about 500,000 ponds now in the UK. You also provide new stepping stone by creating ponds. you extend the amount of clean water habitat. That's very important because a lot of our fresh water is now polluted. By creating ponds, as I've just shown, you can increase freshwater species diversity at the landscape scale, and I'll show you some other evidence in a second. And of course, ponds are very important as nature-based solutions. Creating ponds might actually help us adapt to climate change, particularly in terms of biodiversity. But also, ponds are brilliant because they're actually relatively simple and cheap to make, and the results are extremely fast. So when we're looking at the decline in freshwater wildlife, creating ponds and creating enough ponds might actually help with stopping or at least slowing this decline of biodiversity, freshwater biodiversity. This is again from a paper that was published in 2020. This is actually a study that is located at one of our Ponderful demo sites, water-friendly farming in the Midlands. And we've been working this catchment over a very long period of time to try and improve the water environment and understand it better. And what we found is by creating clean water ponds, we've actually reversed the decline. So by creating those ponds, we've managed to increase landscape diversity, catchment diversity by 25%. This is for wetland plants. So this is pretty amazing result. And to be honest, it's something we knew, but we've never actually been able to show it in that way at that landscape scale. So very important results. And it shows the importance of creating these water bodies. This is in a normal agricultural landscape in central England. Another thing is people always ask me, or often ask me, should you create, should you manage, or should you restore? Which is the best? And honestly, it's irrelevant. You start with the place you're working in. You assess the place you're working in, and then you decide what is the best for wildlife and what's the best at the pond level. So pond management is a really important measure. It's more of a light intervention than pond restoration. For example, just managing a few trees to provide more sunny part of the pond. And this can be a really important measure to maintain good condition for specific species or specific group. Pond restoration is also extremely important. And by restoring pond, you can potentially also restore the plant community from the existing seed bank. And it's particularly important where you have no space for new ponds and all the ponds are overshaded and silted up, which we have now in quite a few landscapes because of the changes in agricultural practices from grazing to arable. Pond creation, of course, you're adding high quality habitat and stepping stone and so on. But what's really important about pond creation and a plus point is that you can control where you put new ponds and you can control the design and you can make sure they don't have polluted water. So just to reiterate that all these measures are valid, they all have their place. You need to start by understanding the place where you work. Okay, so hopefully you kind of knew most of what I've already told you. But now let's talk about pond creation proper. So I'm going to give you a very short overview of the process, and then we're going to discuss locating ponds, the water sources, and clean water. So the process is relatively simple. You do need to start with desk study to try and learn as much as you can from the area you're working in, and obviously some site visits to try and see where you can create ponds. Once you've done this and you've come up with some ideas, you need to discuss these ideas with the landowner, the site managers, and there might be other stakeholders as well. There might be big local community engagement. There might be people doing natural history or recording at the site. So it's important to understand who are the key players on the site, not just the person that owns it. Then you need to do pre-site checks and monitoring, so hydrology, geology, and so on. So we'll come to that in a bit. You need to try and work out as much as you can whether this is going to work. At that point, you can go back, once you've understood what you needed to know, you can go back to the stakeholders and then you can finalize a plan, including the pond design and the nitty-gritty of the scheme. Then you need to get permissions. If you need them, you don't always need them, it's not a given, and I'll come back to that later. And then you actually do the digging, which is the fun bit. And then you need to think of what happened afterwards, because it's not just good enough to make the pond. You need to make sure it works. Is there drains? Do you have to go back? And ideally, but it's not always easy, you should really monitor the biodiversity to understand. And that feeds into future scheme. The more you understand how a pond behaves and what lives in it, then you can actually use that knowledge to improve the next lot of pond that you do. And then, of course, you can sit back and enjoy, because it is a very fun and satisfying thing to go back to sites a few years later, or 10 years or 15 years later, and to see this amazing wildlife using these small waters. So the process can be very quick, it could take weeks, or it can take years. And that very much depends on the scale of what you're proposing, but also on the site characteristics. Is it very complex or is it very simple? So thinking about where you want to put your new ponds, well, you can't really create ponds in any type of landscape. You just need the right geology and hydrology. You can create ponds in urban areas. You just need to collect clean rainwater. So what you really need to look at, do you have a clean water source? Also look at existing wetlands. Can you create more habitat near these wetlands and extend population already on the sites? You need to look at the terrestrial habitat, because of course it's not just the pond itself that matters, it's the interaction with the terrestrial habitat around it. And this is particularly important for amphibians, but all sorts of other animals and plants as well do rely on good semi-natural terrestrial habitat. And you need to think about what fits in the landscape. You know, you wouldn't want to try and create a massive lake in an area where there's only small ponds. There is, again, you need to look at the landscape and understand what would fit in the landscape. Or the other example is trying to create a big pond on a slope, which in terms of engineering would be difficult anyway, but also you just wouldn't fit there. So there is something, as you hone your experience about what fits in the landscape, is very important. What you don't want to do is to replace existing wetlands. So if you already have a headwater stream, a flush or a spring, don't stick a pond on it, because that will have value in itself. You want to add to the freshwater landscape, not replace one habitat by another. You also want to try and avoid locations where your pond's going to be disturbed, degraded, or, as I said, polluted, because that's not going to maximize the benefits for wildlife. So just to illustrate, you start with an area where you have a damp hollow, or you have a small flush, a little bit of a spring there, headwater stream, and then an old pond, a temporary pond. You might go in the summer and it might be dry, and you might think, well, there's not much there. Be very careful with these temporary ponds, because they can potentially support some really good wildlife. And again, you don't want to replace one habitat by another. So what we try and encourage is you create ponds around those habitat, adding to the fresh water, adding water habitat effectively, rather than replacing them. In terms of disturbance, well, I'm sure you've seen your typical dog ponds in many parks, including, you know, London parks or things like that, but also sometimes in the countryside where there's a lot of people go. And one of the big problems we have in these areas is dogs. I have to say, I love dogs. It's not the individual dogs, it's all the dogs together that will jump into that pond and have great fun. But in the meantime, they will stir sediments, they will stop plants establishing, and potentially as well pollute the water with pesticides. It's been found now that potentially the anti-worming things you put on dogs' necks could leach into the water. So here, just to illustrate, you have a photo here of a pond with a willow weave in the middle. And you can see this area is accessed by dogs. You have not much there other than water and turbid water, which is not obvious from this photo. On the other side, on the other hand, you have a beautiful plant community, a lot of invertebrates. And this is just what happens if you have a lot of dogs jumping into a pond. The other problem we have, of course, is the introduction of fish, particularly goldfish. Again, it's very rare that I see as many goldfish as that, but carp, any kind of carp usually is not very good for wildlife because they root at the bottom and release nutrients into the water. And there's direct predation, of course. So if you're going to be working in public access area, you need to think about zoning the ponds. So this is, again, a little illustration to try and explain this. You have a car park here. You might have a pond near the car park where you let dogs go in. That's your dog ponds, basically, your sacrificial pond. Might not be great wildlife in there, but it's still going to have a purpose. On the other hand, you might have ponds where you actively encourage scrubbing up of the edges. And so you can actually have plants developing. Plants are really the basis for a lot of the community of invertebrates and other animals. And then you might have another ponds where you do pond dipping, for example. So you're trying to have different ponds for different objectives, rather than trying to make one ponds and then it's not really going to be that great for wildlife because there's going to be too many different things going on there. So very important to think about that at the outset and to understand the path that people take and where they go. Here's an example of some ponds we've created in a public park. This is actually in Milton Keynes. And you can see all around there are houses. This is a canal. And then you have this millennium woodlands that was planted relatively recently. This is a playing field. And so we created some ponds first in the scrubby bits to try and effectively hide them from people. And then we created a bigger pond in the middle there, but it was very kind of tall, kind of rank vegetation, rough grasslands. And we thought, oh, maybe people won't see it. And of course, that didn't quite work. And now we've had to fence them. This is actually just after it was fenced, so it doesn't look like that anymore. We've put a gate so that it's easy for machinery to go in there and do the management in the long term. But these ponds are actually developing really well. And now they're protected from people and their dog. The people can enjoy them from the sides rather than actually go in. And all these ponds are now positive for great crested newt. So this is really good. Right, let's think about water sources for ponds. There's three main water sources for ponds. So surface water ponds, which is usually on clay, or you can have ponds in mountains as well that are fed by surface water. So surface water is just the rainwater falling on the ground and then draining into the pond. So it's the same principle as a river catchment or anything like that, but it's obviously much smaller. And the important thing for surface water pond, you need to make sure the catchment is free of pollution. So you get clean rainwater into your ponds. Now you have ponds fed by streams and ditches directly, and this often brings pollution. So you need to watch out for that and make sure that your stream or your ditch is actually clean water. But of course, this stream or ditch will also bring sediment. And so the pond will fill up much faster. So again, you need to think about the long-term management and the fact that you probably, within 10 years or so, you will have to go and desilt. Now you have groundwater fed pond as well. And this is where you have sands, gravel, or peats. And this can have very good water quality. Again, it very much depends on the area. So this is quite different, but of course, things are never simple in nature. And so you can have a different mixture of different water source at different ponds. Now, the main question really in all this is, will the pond hold water? And there, all you need to do really is to check the substrate. So is it clay, is it sand and gravel, is it rock, is it peat, what is it? Is it mixed? And I'll show you some picture in a second. Now, once you've checked the substrate, you need to decide whether you need to monitor the hydrology of the site to try and make sure that you will actually have water in your pond. So it's really essential to have trial holes or deep wells unless you get really waterlogged clay. And this is the blue clay, as we call it, and I've got a picture to show you. And then you need to monitor. And you need to monitor for at least one summer, sometimes longer. You know, if you had like we had a drought, we had to continue monitoring for much longer because you're trying to understand the hydrology and if it's obviously very, very weather dependent. If you are working with groundwater, then you're trying to understand what is the maximum level the groundwater is rising to and what is the minimum, because then you can actually adjust your design to either create ponds that are permanent or temporary. But this is very important with groundwater because there can be very large fluctuation in water level. And of course, for groundwater fed pond, particularly, you need to check the water quality as well. So here it is, checking the substrate. Well, how do you do that? You can use an auger, which is this kind of corkscrew thing here, which is on a long pole, and then you just turn it into the ground. You can use a digger as well. This is a small digger. Sometimes we use larger diggers. It's faster. And this is what, on clay substrate, this is what you're looking for. This is really, we call it blue clay, but in fact it's gray locus, and that indicate waterlogged clay. So if you were to find this, you could actually dig pretty much very quickly. If you don't, then really you should put in trial holes and make sure you monitor. When you do this, you do need to record the soil profile. So, you know, what's for each of the layers, what's the color, what is texture, and potentially at what depth you reach water, because sometimes you go down and you reach an aquifer and then the water bubbles up because it was under pressure. When you say clay, there is 1,001 kind of clay, probably even better. And as you move to different parts of the country, you'll find very different colors and very different textures, which is actually in itself quite interesting. So the substrate can be very variable even at a single site. And this is even more the case on floodplain, when you have lots of deposits from different time. And so I put this slide here to show you. Now, these are all clays from the same sites. You can see here's more bluey at the bottom. This is very mottled, as we say, which is basically shows water level fluctuations. So in these situations, you can see even though it's the same site, every single photo, every single trial hole is different. So at that place, you definitely want to create some test pits and monitor them to make sure that you're going to have the water. Test pits can be, there's no great kind of special things about test pits. They're basically a hole in the ground that goes to probably about 0.5 meter deeper than you want the ponds to be. And then you need to make a ramp so if animals fall in, they can come out. And then you need to think about fencing them. So this open test pit here was fenced by the landowner to stop the sheep falling in. Here, it's an area of public access, so we've had to fence it as well. You can also use deep wells, which is basically a pipe with hole in, and that then allow you to see what happens to the water table. So deep wells are particularly good for sand and gravel or in fens. Once you've done this, you need to go and monitor it and just literally record the water levels. And then, as I said, you also need to think about water quality because you don't want dirty water into your nice new ponds. So here's an example of a site on an arable reversion. This is a 4-hectare site which has been put back to grass and is going to be managed extensively with low intensity grazing. We did some trial holes first. So the trial holes at the bottom, this is the bottom of the hill, were more gravelly, but also with a lot of clay. Those at the top of the hill, when I say hill, it's a little inclined, but those further up had a lot more clay in them. And in fact, those hold water for much longer, they're much higher, they're filled much quicker than those at the bottom. But it creates variety at the site level. And this is what one of the ponds looked like when we'd actually finished. These were specifically created for great crested newts, and 2 years on, 4 of the ponds have already colonized. There are some ponds in the landscape, but as you can see, it is quite intensively arable, but there is actually quite a few ponds. So the newts have come of their own within a couple of years. Now, in terms of the size, the ponds range from about 300 to 800 meters squared. which are optimum for great crested newt breeding, but they will, of course, provide a habitat for all sorts of other things. And we really look forward to look at the plant community, particularly at that site. So clean water. Well, clean water is really just unpolluted water. Is what the natural water quality should be if there was no addition of fertilizers, nutrients, road runoff, or any of the other things that pollute ponds. It's really important for most freshwater plants and animals, and particularly amphibian larvae need clean water, but also many of the sensitive wetland plants that have declined so much in the last few decades. So you can take some water samples, send them to the lab, but what we use now mostly at Freshwater Habitats Trust is those what we call rapid field kits that we get from Japan. We had a project a few years ago called Clean Water for Wildlife, where we tested those kits and we came up with an interpretation to help people interpret what is actually clean water and what isn't. So these are very useful because in 5 minutes, you can actually work out whether you are whether a stream has clean water or the existing ponds have clean water. And that gives you a lot of information that will feed into your pond creation scheme. Actually, one of the most important things as well is to look at the wider landscape, and particularly at the land use and potential source of pollution in the landscape as well. That's very important. If you don't have access to water chemistry, that can actually be very, very useful. So clearly, polluted ponds are not good for wildlife. You can imagine these ponds in an arable field in the Midlands is getting all this runoff from which will include fertilizers and pesticides and heavy metals and all sorts. This is a typical duckweed pond, clearly has some nutrient problem there. And this is filamentous algae, and these ponds won't be optimum for wildlife. They won't be dead. There will still be something living in there, but it's not really going to be great wildlife habitat at all. So other than the obvious sources of pollution, you also need to watch out for excessive wildfowl. So for example, you create some nice ponds on the floodplain and then you have massive flocks of Canada geese that come and ruin your work. It happens. More difficulties, people putting fish at the bottom, again, those carp that are really bad. Again, is having too much of something, it's very hard to control the fish. And again, excessive disturbance by dog or having too much livestock grazing, which again degrade the pond potentially. But bear in mind, livestock or grazing is also a natural process. And I'll show you later that it is actually something to consider right at the outset. Usually it's very positive. Okay, so in terms of clean water for ponds, you want your ponds to be, your nice new pond to be in semi-natural habitats and ideally not linked to polluted stream or ditches. And whereas in this illustration here, you can see the stream will bring polluted water from urban areas, from arable lands. But as I said, in urban areas, you can actually use rainwater from roof as your water source. So clean water ponds can be created in any landscape. You just need to think about where the water is going to come from. And you need to understand in the surface water pathways. So where is the water coming from? And to illustrate this, here is there was 3 ponds created in this bit of heathlands in Wales. Really nice, a designated site, absolutely beautiful, naturally very low in nutrients. And you can really see clearly the difference between the place that is designated and has heathlands and then the agricultural lands. So you basically went from this to this over a few decades. And the water runs towards the pond from the farm. And it was really interesting because the top pond, so the pond that is the closest to the farm and is getting the most of the water coming from the farm, I detected a little bit of phosphate, 0.02 to 0.05, which is not massive, but in a place like this, it's already quite a lot. And what was interesting is the plant cover was already, these are 2-year-old ponds, already 80% of the ponds was covered in plant. And you can see the dreaded bulrush there at the front, which is something you need to watch about with new ponds. The ponds at the bottom that was further away and was getting less nutrients, or perhaps not even any nutrients, the species diversity was the same. So you had the same amount of different species, but the plant cover was so much lower. And also the level of phosphate were lower. So this is the lower detection level of those little kits I showed you. So it's probably even lower than that. And really, this pond here that is not getting these added nutrients will last for much longer. And it's already a good wildlife habitat. It already has vegetation. Whereas this top pond here will need management probably quite soon, because within a couple more years, it will be completely full and say it will not be a very good habitat for amphibians, for example. So it's really important to understand where the water is coming from and what this water is potentially going to carry with it. Here's an example of a pond complex that we created, which is near a polluted stream. This is normal agricultural lands, again in central England. And we created 6 ponds on a 4-hectare field. They vary in terms of surface area, up to 1,000 meters squared. In terms of depth, they're between 1 and 1.5 meter. And these ponds are not going to be fed by the stream because it's very polluted as well as being quite incised. So here it is. You have the stream, which obviously goes further up there. The stream on this side, very polluted. We don't want that water. We have an arable field there with the land running this way, and we definitely don't want that water either. Thankfully, there is a ditch here that take that dirty water away. And we put some trial holes, which filled very quickly and stayed high quite a lot. There is probably both surface water, that is the catchment of the ponds, where I've got the blue arrows. And there is probably the deeper one are linked to the groundwater. But again, the monitoring of the trial holes showed that the groundwater was clean. So these ponds were just done this summer. They have filled already. You can trust me on that. But we don't really know how they're going to develop. What's interesting here is that you can see the parallel channels from the stream before it was straightened and deepened. And our ponds overlap with this. So this is going to be very interesting in terms of looking at what plants are coming back here. But also, we are quite close from other high quality, relatively small, but high quality sites, which are reservoir biodiversity. So it'd be very interesting to monitor over the next few years and to see what comes up. Also, what we did here is create some very low bunds. We're talking literally 20 centimeters, so very, very small, just to hold a little bit more of that nice clean water before it reaches the stream. So you can play, you can also play with the topography to try and hold that water back. And arguingly, this is a little bit of natural flood management, although that's not the reason we did it in the first place. Right, so you found your location, you've got clean water and the right setup to actually do some pond creation. And you need to think about designing the scheme, designing the ponds. So, as I said, you need to understand the pondscape, you need to understand the objectives, you need to understand public access and is there any historic features. You need to understand the other water bodies on the site. Is there any ghost ponds, for example, that you could restore, which is kind of pond creation, but not really. And there's some really interesting information there on the guide that was just published from UCL, who are the specialists on the ghost pond restoration. So you can find those usually from historic map, but also from walkovers and going on site. You also need to think about specific species of conservation concern. You can by all means create just some clean water ponds for wildlife, but in some places you might have some species you particularly want to cater for and create the right condition for them. So this is all things you need to think about. And really what we're trying to do is to restore the habitat heterogeneity in, say, in this case, grasslands. So you start with, say, you have one pond in this landscape. And really what we want to do by the time we finish with it is to create lots of different kinds of ponds. Even in places where there's no pollution, even ruts can be very good for wildlife and add a little bit of temporary habitat, which some specialist species can take advantage of. So in this illustration here, you can see we've gone for the longhorn cattle here, so it's a little bit, feels a bit rewilding. You might put some pond, you might think about a pond per field. Could we actually restore a pond per field, which is very likely to have been the case when there was a lot more grazing in the landscape. But also it's where you put your pond. Put some ponds in or near woodlands, because these will be more sheltered. They will also create very nice semi-natural habitats. Put ponds where there's already ponds, so that you might actually get less grazing pressure on any one of them. So really think about, I always start with basically going slightly mad and going, oh, there. And then you narrow down what's going to work the best. But try and be ambitious as well in what you're trying to do at that landscape scale. Similar principle on floodplain. You start with your river, which has been, probably deepened and straightened, and floodplain is not necessarily functioning very well anymore. That river, certainly in central England, is also probably going to be polluted, and you might have a couple of large water bodies. Now, in this illustration, you can see again, it's the principle almost of a pond per field, but also a little pond complex here, where you would have maybe some temporary ponds and some permanent waters. Again, nesting ponds into the woods, where they'll be more protected and that they're developed differently. And you can also design them differently. These are food drains, which are often created for wetland birds as well. So there's not one kind of pond, there's one kind of thing you should do. Try to bring back all that water into this landscape that have been drained. Here's an example of a pond network into woodland, and we started working on this in 2011. And so this is nice semi-natural woodland. It is forestry as well. It actually belongs to Forestry England, who we work with quite a lot, very successfully. And he only had a couple of ponds with great crested newt. So this work was done for great crested newt as well. But the other ponds were very small, very shallow, and some of them even didn't really function as ponds anymore. So what we did as part of the Million Ponds project is create another 9 ponds. This one in the middle here is actually the dog pond. And this is the one that's terrible for wildlife, but you need to have some dog ponds. And so after we did this work, about 5 years later, we found that quite a few of these ponds have already been colonized by great crested newt and had breeding populations. And then as part of the work of the Newt Conservation Partnership in 2018, we had funds to add some more ponds in an area of the woods that didn't have many. So we created 5 ponds. Again, they range in surface area from 200 to 600 meters squared. And they're relatively simple in terms of design. They go to about 1 to 1.5 meters. The little one probably is 0.8 meters. So again, trying to create different ponds on the same sites. What's interesting now is that from the results of 2023 surveys, all these 5 ponds are positive. Are positive for great crested newt using eDNA, and all the older ponds are also positive. So in a 10-year period, we've vastly increased the great crested newt population at the site, all through natural colonization, only by creating ponds in that wood, which is of course good terrestrial habitat. And we are hoping to do more in the future, but it's getting quite hard to convince people that they do need more ponds in that wood. What's interesting as well there is that we surveyed for plants in the summer for the first time, and what we found, it was some locally rare plants. So we're going to carry on doing this work as well. I'd love, of course, to survey for invertebrates. We know the dragonfly population has completely exploded at that site, but unfortunately, that's not something we can fund at this time, but we are always looking out for things like that. Okay, thinking about the pond design, You need to think about depth and surface area. But really, both these things really depends on the substrates and also on the site characteristics. There is no right depth, but as I said, most of our ponds are around 1 to 1.5 meter. If you have really good water quality and it's a groundwater fed pond, so it's fed by an aquifer, then you could go a lot deeper, because then you would still get light penetration and you could still have a very nice underwater plant community. The underwater plants are really important for all the other wildlife, and of course they are very important in themselves. So we're trying to create ponds where we create conditions that would benefit the aquatic, true aquatic plants. If you are on clay, like particularly some of the clay we're dealing with in the Midlands in the UK, as soon as it rains or as soon as any disturbance, the clay goes in suspension. And so these ponds can be quite cloudy. And if you go too deep, that means plants find it very hard to become established. What's interesting is that once plants have become established, then water clarity really improves. But the lack of water clarity is not pollution, it's completely natural. So that's very important to make that distinction. Okay, so I'll show you some more example of different scheme. But what you need to think about as well is the drawdown zone, the margins, and the pond bank. The underwater topography. You can have some very simple basin ponds that are just very simple, but you can also play a little bit more with that underwater topography, and I'll touch on islands. But the main point is keep it simple and consider, if you have any target species, what do they actually need? What kind of hydro period? Do they want permanent pond, temporary pond? Do they need wide fluctuation in water level? All these things feed into the design. And you also need to think about the land management, because you don't create the same kind of ponds in a place that's going to be grazed or not grazed. So small ponds can be really good. And this is an example of about 7 ponds we created about 10 years ago now for the rare tassel stoneworts. And that species is a very poor competitor. It's very rare in the UK. And it needs temporary waters and it needs a lot of mud. So these were actually hand dug by some volunteers. And as you can see, the ponds are very small. And when they fill, they look like this. And then as they dry out, they would reveal these little pools that will create that micro topography. So this is quite a specialist habitat in some ways, but these can be added next to larger habitat as well. So ponds, small ponds can be very good. They're also very cheap. Obviously, if you had a digger, you could have done that in 5 minutes. So one large pond is good, but try and think in terms of multiple ponds, either as a pond network or as a pond complex, as we call it. And all a pond complex is actually having ponds with different sizes and depth, so that you get a range of hydro periods. So in this illustration here, you would have some shallow ponds that would dry out. These are the small seasonal pool. You can have large seasonal pool. So depth and permanence are not necessarily completely related. Size and permanence are not always completely related. By all means, create also, if you have the good water quality, create also a larger, deeper ponds. So this is really should inspire rather than be actually repeated like this. Again, you need to look at your side, but try to think about that diversity of pond type. And good wildlife pond really, they tend to have shallow water. It doesn't have to be at the edge, but shallow water is really super important. It's important for many plants. It's important also for many of the invertebrates that live in ponds. That, you know, if you're a 3 millimeter water beetle, do you want to be in the middle of the pond, or do you want to be somewhere you're going to be able to hide, you're going to have food? And also shallows are much warmer than the middle of the pond. So think about this kind of 10 centimeter and try and design ponds that always have, no matter what the water level is, always going to have a little bit at least, but a lot even better, of shallow water. Good wildlife ponds often also have wide drawdown zone. So water level fluctuation in ponds is very natural. And the drawdown zone is just a difference between the maximum winter water level in winter and the minimum water level, usually at the end of the summer, but obviously it can vary depending on the weather. And many of the ponds we see created have a narrow drawdown zone. And this place, this drawdown zone can be the richest part of the pond in terms of number of species that live there. So try and create a much longer drawdown zone to maximize this area. And your pond will support even more wildlife than it would if it was a narrow drawdown zone. So good to think about that and not to be particularly worried about water level fluctuations. Now, in order to achieve this, of course, if you want a wide drawdown zone, then you need a low angle for your margin. And this is where you might be limited by space. You might not have very much space, in which case you might not be able to do this long drawdown zone. And this is where asymmetric design can be really helpful. So this is just design of a little ponds, 15 by 10. And by creating an asymmetric profile, you're actually still creating this area that as the water recedes, these are contour lines, as the water recedes, will expose this drawdown zone. But then you're also going to have steeper banks. There's nothing wrong with having some steep banks. So that's really just very simple, but very useful way of thinking about design where you don't have much space. Of course, if you have a lot of space, you can really go for it in terms of creating this nice shallow water. So here, for example, the slope is 1 in 20. So it would take you 22 meters to go down by 1 meter. And then because this pond is 60 meters by 30 meters, which is not massive, but it's already good size, then we also have relatively shallow slope on the other parts of the pond. And this is going to be like a little spits going into the ponds. Of course, for some species, like water vole, but also crayfish, you might actually want some steeper bank. So again, think about what you want to create, what the species are, and what's appropriate for the place, rather than starting by the design. Now, grazing. So there is no good or bad. We're talking low intensity grazing here. We're not talking intensive farming, okay? It is a natural process, and what it will do is just have quite a lot of difference on success, a lot of impact on succession and how the ponds will actually develop. So you can see in this picture here, this pond is not grazed. You can see the fence here, and it's developed quite tall vegetation and quite semi-marginal vegetation as well. You might have some very nice aquatics, so that's not necessarily a bad thing. This pond here, which is grazed by sheep, as you can see, will have much more shallow edges with low vegetation and potentially really good invertebrate community, particularly in this 10 centimeter of water at the edges. And also the grazing and poaching might help diversify the community, providing mud habitat as well for mud species, obviously, but also from other species being able to come and become established, excuse me. So this diagram really illustrates what happens over a longer time period. So you start with some very small, shallow, medium, and deeper pond here. If there's no grazing, of course, it's going to scrub up, and then it's going to become woodland, perhaps even wet woodlands. And then eventually, the small ponds are going to be shaded out. And if they're shallow, they're also going to fill in with sediments. Some of the medium-sized pond might turn into a marshy pool or wet woodland, which is, both valuable habitat as well. And it's only really the larger, the deeper pool that will still be open, but it will have a fair amount of sediment at the bottom from the accumulation of plant matter that fall into the ponds or grows into the ponds. Now, if it's grazed, it's really quite different scenario in that the ponds will remain much more open, and also there will be much less organic matter falling into the ponds. And so they will last for a lot longer into the landscape without requiring management, unless you actually want to create wet woodlands or you want to create some shaded ponds. Okay, so it's not a question of good or bad. It's a question of having different endpoints. In a not graze scenario, if you wanted to maintain open water, you might create some larger and deeper ponds with steeper edge at the edge, not necessarily in the middle. You can still create shallow water in the middle of the pond. Whereas if it's grazed, you can really create those long drawdown zones, which will stay as they are and be maintained in a much longer term. So here's an example of underwater spit. This is a pond that's just been finished. You can see it's already have water. And you can see where the water is likely to sit. And then you can see this underwater spit, which is basically a little bit of land still that going to be close to the water surface, but probably not be exposed until later in spring or in the summer. And because of wave action, these places as well can maintain the mineral substrate for longer. So you won't get an accumulation of sediments, which provides a really good place for aquatic plants to be able to root. Here's an example of an underwater ridge, which is actually very hard to show. This is a double basin pond. So you have a basin here, you have a basin here, and this is a ridge. And in the middle, in winter, this will look at one water body. As the water recedes, potentially this ridge might get very close to the surface or even might be exposed, turning this into two distinct ponds. So again, creating a little bit of variety and creating this kind of raised shallows, these shallows that hopefully will provide good condition for early succession species in the longer term. So you can really be creative with design. And of course, there is also islands. And I'm not going to dwell on islands too much. I'm not a great fan of island unless you have really quite large water bodies or you're creating reed beds or something much more, hectares of habitat rather than a single pond. Because inevitably, if you create an island that sticks above water, then vegetation is going to develop. And then you're going to have a management issue, unless that's what you wanted in the same place. So you're going to have trees there. Can you actually get to them to manage them? Do you want trees in your island or not? You can play with the height of islands, particularly if you are dealing with groundwater fed ponds, because you should understand the maximum and minimum water levels from your monitoring. And then you could actually create underwater islands, shoals effectively, of different heights and have some of them maybe just become exposed in spring or a bit later in the summer. So again, depending on, it's much harder to do that on clay, because on clay, you are really subject to the rainwater that is falling in the pond catchment. So it's much harder to plan at the outset. But then if you have the luxury of being able to go back once you've done your creation, maybe the next year or the year after, and you can bring a digger back, then you could actually adjust the design at that stage. So yes, not a great fan of island. But like I say, if we were doing some larger things, I think I would consider it more. Okay, let's think about practical considerations. So spoil disposal is obviously important to understand where that's going to go and to actually deal with this quite early on in the planning of the scheme. You need to really be clear that you're not going to dig up a gas pipeline. So do check utilities at the site. There are surprises. We've had surprises, never an accident, but surprises. Check which permission you might need, and this is very country dependent. But also really important, you need to manage the landowner expectation. And this goes for many different types of landowner, even landowners that work in nature conservation. And this is what I put this picture here. This is a pond that's just finished. It is muddy. You cannot make ponds without ending up with some mud. It's just not possible. And sometimes landowners just think you can do that, and they get really worried about the amount of mud you've made on their lands. Now, by managing that, by explaining how quickly it recovers, usually it's fine. But it's really important to kind of manage those expectations. Managing contractors is also really crucial. I'm not going to get to it in great detail, but you really need to make sure you work with either somebody experienced or you need to supervise throughout. We have had situations where our pond ended up to be rectangles for some reason, which is definitely not what we were trying to do. And there's a few other cases as well where we weren't able to be on site. Then the results was really not what we expected. You know, think swimming pool here. So you need to provide some design. You need to explain exactly what you want. And many contractors are used to doing ornamental lakes or much larger water body, and they do not understand what we're doing. They do not understand that this actually looks flat, but this probably goes to 1.5 meters. And it's only when we work with them long enough, and then they can see the ponds when they fill with water, and they can see the ponds are permanent if we wanted them to be permanent, then they really get it. And we work with some excellent contractors. We tend to go back to the same people. And one contractor in particular, Sean Hancock, is really an artist in the sculpting of those ponds. So spoil, what do you do with it? Well, first of all, you need to think about the difference between the topsoil, which is nutrient rich, and you definitely want to stay away. You want the topsoil to stay away from your pond. Again, contractors often put the topsoil back on the banks because they think that it's going to vegetate faster. It's not necessarily what you're looking for. Again, it depends on the circumstance, but I would never want the topsoil there because it's full of nutrients. So you can have nutrients leaching back into your pond straight away. The underburden is less of an issue, and you can use the underburden. Sometimes you need to create some bunds, or you can create ecological features, as they're called, so habernacula, butterfly bank. Again, you can be creative depending on the size. The spoil generally can be spread on low-quality grasslands or arable lands. This is the fastest recovering piece of spoil that I've ever seen in my life. So we created some ponds in August 2023. By November, this is the same place. You can see how quickly that's recovered. And it's not always the case. I've just given you the best case scenario here. Sometimes we seed them because people don't like the idea of having a lot of thistles, which is sometimes understandable, but also thistles, of course, are great for pollinators. So again, this needs to be managed and it needs to be thought about at the outset, including how you're going to transport it and how long it's going to take and how much of a mess it's going to make. Generally try to not have the spoil, even the underburden, in the pond's catchments, but below the pond's catchment. Another thing to think about as well is drains. The UK is under drained. The whole of central England is under drained, and you can't always see them. This is a really obvious one. It's got gravel. It's quite an old drain as well. It's clay, but often you don't see them, and they're just under your pond. And then you create this lovely habitat, and they don't fill, and it's always drained. Because of course, if you've done your homework, you should know the substrate is suitable, and that is going to get water into them. So this is all the drain found under a pond about 300 meters squared that we create on really good clay in Sussex, and it wasn't filling, which was really unlikely, but we didn't know they were drains. So we had to go back with the contractors and effectively redig it and find all those drains, take that off, which took a couple of days. So that's important as well to factor in to any pond creation scheme, is have contingency funds if you can. I know it's not always possible with grants, but if you can, to go back and fix and adjust and have another bite at that cherry effectively. Right, checks and permission. I'm not going to go through this in detail. It's very UK based. Of course, it would be different in every country. It's likely you'll have more permissions to get if you're on floodplain, designated sites, of course. Archaeology, I can't say it enough. Talk to archaeologists. We often have a watching brief while we create the ponds, or at least at the outset until we get to a certain depth. But it's really important not to destroy archaeology whilst creating ponds. Utilities check, I've said already. In this country, sometimes you need planning permission, but not always. And of course, you need to check the scheme, the land in which you want to do this is not already in a agri scheme or any scheme that might actually be breaking the law to actually add a pond in that landscape. Right, we're almost there. I wanted to just touch on planting as well. We don't plant our ponds. And this is because we don't want unwanted species, non-native invasives, like New Zealand pygmyweed or parrot's feather or azolla, the water fern, but also because new ponds are not dead, even though you can't see anything to start with. Very, very quickly they become colonized by invertebrates and often very quickly by plant as well. So the common darters, for example, we see them within weeks, literally, or even on the day you finish digging, you already see the dragonfly arriving. It's just, as you can see, the larvae is really well camouflaged. You go to the edge of the pond, you think, my God, there's not much in there. And then you look again and you see a movement. And then when your eye is in, you will see there is full of life. It's just very well camouflaged. If you do plant, because say you're in a public area or you're in an urban areas where you need things to look prettier faster, then at least try and plant the right kind of plants. I call them regionally correct, but also check provenance and check wherever you get it from. Just make sure the nursery is not harboring some of these nasties, as I call them, because they're then impossible to get rid of. If you can, I say, if there's not, the aesthetic consideration is not too strong, then leave the pond for a few years and you'll probably be surprised what actually comes back and what actually becomes established and how quickly. Right, just to illustrate natural colonization, the Great Western New District Licensing Scheme, we have monitoring results for this year. This is going to be published in January. So we've created 247 ponds between 2018 and 2022, specifically for Great Crested Newt. And 42% of these ponds are already colonized. Some of them are very young, and 65% of the site already support newt. So as you can see, for amphibians, it's not really a problem. As long as you locate the pond near existing population, they will come, and they come quite fast. We also surveyed 72 of these ponds for wetland plants. And despite, again, their young age, 83% of these ponds already had high ecological quality as defined by the UK methods for assessing this for ponds. So pretty fast, but most exciting was to see new population, particularly by natural colonization, of nationally and locally rare plants. So there'll be more information in the report, but this plant, lesser water plantain, only one population remain in the county. And so finding this plant, there's only one plant, but 2 years in a row that plant has been there, or perhaps it's a different plant, it's hard to tell. That means we basically doubled the population by creating new clean water pond within dispersal distance of this. This is probably because of birds moving things about. Common bladderwort as well is regionally rare. And so that was very nice, beautiful plants. Unfortunately, actually, the day after this picture was taken, some dogs jumped into the ponds and all the flowers were broken. But anyway, it was there again the year after, so that's great. So as you can see, natural colonization really works, but it really depends on the location and on the objective of the pond creation scheme. So to conclude, well, clean water pond creation, it's cheap, it's relatively simple, and it's fast, and it can really contribute to reverse the decline of freshwater wildlife. And as I said, pond creation is simple, but it does actually require quite a basic understanding, not an in-depth understanding, but a good understanding of a wide range of subjects. You need to know a little bit about geology and soil, hydrology. You need to obviously understand species and habitat. You need to understand the land use type, the landscape, land management practices, and you need to understand people, be it the people using the site, it might be the landowner, or just the contractor, or just the people you're asking permission from. So it requires quite a range of skill, but it's actually really simple. And once you've done it once or twice, it's actually really pleasurable thing to do. Now, we aim to create clean water ponds, and what we want these ponds to be sustainable in the long term. So require as little management as possible. and that provide maximum benefit for wildlife. And I will now refer you to the Ponderful project. Next year we're going to publish a technical manual for ponds as NBS that will cover creation, restoration, and management. And much sooner than that, I think probably in the new year, early in the new year, there's also going to be case studies published about the 12 demo sites that are located in different parts of Europe. So do have a look at the website. There's a lot of information on there already. Thank you very much. This is the end of the talk, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Pascale. We have a lot of questions in the chat. Maybe I will start with that ones, and then we can move to other questions that people want to ask. Here on the chat we have Paul that asked, my local farm has several farm flight ponds that are all falling into decay. Is there anything I can offer them, people to direct them to fix it? They will have no budget.
Yes. The money. That's always the issue of the money, isn't there? It kind of depends what you need to do. You know, pond restoration can be, or pond management can be relatively expensive, but it also can be done in stages. And I think the first thing I would do, I mean, obviously completely in the abstract here, would be to try and understand as much about the pond as possible before even decided what to do. And perhaps start small. If you don't have any budgets, that kind of will limit potentially what people can do. But sometimes on farmland, people have their own equipment and they're quite happy to do a little bit on the side. So that's all I can offer, I'm afraid.
Okay, thank you. Glenn also answered about some capital works under the countryside stewardship. So if anyone has any wants to know more about it, go check her comment because it has a link. So there is more information about it. Also, we have a comment from Sarah that asks, what would be the reason behind putting lots of ponds in a small space? Are you hoping to see different species?
Yes, you will get different species if you have different hydro periods. And potentially, because ponds are very dynamic habitats, if you create 3 ponds or 10 ponds next to each other, they will all turn into slightly different habitats. They might have species that are common in all of them, but then just the one pond might have the one species because colonization is very stochastic. There's a random element to it. There will also be grazing effects, or you might have some deer or livestock or something like that. So it is very, if you actually go and see a site that was done all at the same time where you have multiple ponds, you tend to see quite a bit of difference between the ponds. I mean, it depends on the situation as well and what your species pool is in the first place, of course.
Another question here. Our parish council have dug a pond at the site with clay soil, but doesn't hold water. What would be the best way to line the pond?
So this is a pond that was created but doesn't work.
Yeah, it doesn't hold water. Yeah.
It doesn't hold water, so there could be drains. So that's possible, and it's usually if there are drains in the landscape, then the drain need to go somewhere. So you might want to go to the nearest ditch or the nearest stream and see, particularly when it rains, whether you have a pipe that links to that. It may be that the substrate is not adequate. I haven't talked about line ponds here, of course, because now it's difficult to cover everything. But so I would start by trying to understand the hydrology and the substrates, because it must be one of the two. So either it has no catchments, or it has unsuitable geology, or it has drains. That's what I would probably go with as the obvious.
Yeah. Sarah also asked, why not make the pond deeper than 1.5 meters? There is any chance that will dry out each summer, which is not great for amphibians?
Okay, so it very much depends on the substrates. As I said, we tend to work mostly with clay substrates, but also it very much is a function of the catchment area. So you could have, if you have a large catchment, every time it rains, this pond is going to be refilled. Now, for amphibians, actually, occasional drying, so semi-permanent ponds, maybe that dry every 5 or 10 years, it's actually quite good because it tends to decrease predation pressure for a little bit. You have a population explosion, and then and then it starts again. So occasional drying is not very good. We are obviously thinking about climate change and the potential impact in terms of changing the climate and what that might have on ponds. But it's much easier to make a pond more shallow than it is to deepen it. And we are tending to go towards what we know, because we are by now have created over 1,000 ponds and over 200 ponds for Great Western Newt, and these don't dry out unless there's a problem. So it tends to work quite nicely. I wouldn't really recommend this for any country and any situation. This is very much the experience in the UK. If you were to create ponds, say in Mediterranean regions anyway, you would not necessarily expect them to be permanent. You might not want them to be all permanent, because you have those typically really rich and beautiful temporary ponds, and perhaps that would be what you would try and create. So certainly in the areas we work, 1 to 1.5 meter usually works well. But as I said, if you had some really nice groundwater, and you could go deeper if you wanted to.
Yeah, just it's important to make sure that the pond has the shallow waters,
Yes, definitely.
So Angela here asked something that you already told us, if you feel the need to introduce planting or just wait for natural colonization. And Monica answers that she saw a few ponds where natural colonization just didn't happen. So in that cases, what should we do?
Oh, I've never seen that ever. I have to say. It'd be interesting to know more about the landscape and why. Why would that be the case? I mean, things move about naturally. That's how things disperse. I mean, in some of the ponds that we created on grasslands, we even found snails very quickly. The snails are supposedly very poor dispersers, but actually, you've got the birds moving about. You've got, I mean, a frog hopping about could take some seeds from one pond to the next. So is it a very isolated pond? Is there no source of any propagules or seeds or of any kind? I'm honestly quite surprised, because this is certainly not my experience. In urban areas, that might be the case. But if that is the case, then consider planting it.
Yeah, I'm not sure, Monica, if you want to add something about these cases. You can just talk if you want. Don't think so. So maybe you can move to the other question. This is a a funny one. When does a pond becomes a lake?
Right. I'm going to keep this short because we're going to have a long conversation about this. In fact, in different countries, the upper limit is different. So in Switzerland, for example, it's 5 hectares, and in some other countries, even higher. But as it happens, there has been some work that has looked at that, and around the 1 to 2 hectares is where you see changes in the invertebrate community. Now, there hasn't been massive amount of work on this, and to be completely honest, this is not something that's very important. They're just words, and as humans, we have to have categories for everything. We need to name things, because that's how then policy works, and that's how then conservation can then rely on those policies. So I wouldn't get hung up about what's a puddle, what's a pond. And in fact, in natural system, you can even have streams and ponds that you can have, a place could start as a pond and then turn into a stream, turn into a pond again. So those distinction between these water bodies they're not really that important, I would say.
Okay, another question concerning land ownership. In your experience, it is preferable to look for areas that are already public, or it's also feasible to purchase private lands, or even better, to convince or incentivize private owners to create and management ponds?
I think any, really. Public access area will have their own problem, as I explained, potentially with access, actually degradation of the pond, because people don't realize, but that can be dealt with, and it's really important people see the wildlife and interact with it. So you can think about it in those terms. Obviously, it's going to be different in different countries as well. The UK has relatively few area of open access compared to some other European countries. Private landowners will need incentivizing, so it will be agri schemes or the schemes that we're doing for newts. We work a lot with private landowners because we can then give them management payment for the long term, which is obviously very attractive. We also really focusing on land that is very poor for agriculture. What we like is what farmers hate. So really waterlogged soil, effectively. So I would go for anything that works.
Yeah.
I don't think there's any type of landowner that's best than the other. We try to avoid very commercial people or people, we obviously try to work with people that will, I think, appreciate the work and have at least some elements of biodiversity awareness. But, take it where you can, really. That pretty much would be my advice.
Yeah. Also, Jill asked, digging soil or subsoil will release carbon dioxide stored in the ground. Is there any research to indicate how soon that carbon will be resequestrated and stored?
Not that I know of. Not that I know of, no. But think about the footprint of those ponds is actually pretty small for the biodiversity benefit. And that's one of the USP, the unique selling points of ponds, is that they are small, but actually the amount of species that will then live in them and the amount of potential other ecosystem services that will be provided will be massive. So it's not just about carbon sequestration, of course, it's about trying to make sure that we stop or at least slow the decline of freshwater biodiversity. But it is an interesting question, and I'd really like to know if somebody could go and find out and tell me. That would be great.
Yeah, that's true. A question not related with ponds. Someone asked about, liked very much your diagrams in the slides and wonder what program did you use to create it?
Oh, right. My boyfriend. Which actually used the sledgehammer to crack a nut because he used a 3D modeling program based on drawings from my colleagues. So I'm sure there's much simpler way to do it, but it was nice and cheap. So that was good.
Nice. A question from Miguel. It is possible to create a pond by using a bathtub?
Well, see, why not? Any containers, particularly in gardens, you can do ponds in buckets. You could do any size ponds in garden. I mean, I have 3 garden ponds. They're all small and they're really good fun to make. So yes, any container. The main thing is clean water. Just use rainwater. Don't fill it from the tap. The tap is full of nitrate and phosphates. And some of the ponds in my garden are actually linked to the roof, so they fill up. Except in the drought last year, but otherwise I don't have to fill them up. They fill automatically from the rainwater.
Yeah. I'm not sure if I missed any question here. Here from Paul, my local, no, this is the beginning, I think. So I don't think there are more questions. Do you have any tips or considerations for creating ponds for dragonflies on deep pits or for dragonflies?
I think good water quality, and again, thinking about those aquatic plants, that would be the advice. And again, shallow water. So pretty much all the things that we've discussed that I've presented in this webinar would lead to a good dragonfly community. But again, the location is really important. You know, if it's too isolated, then but dragonfly, they're pretty good at dispersal. So I think if you just apply what I've presented today, you should get an interesting dragonfly population, and you'll get even more interesting dragonfly population if you're near existing high quality sites for dragonflies.
Yeah. Here, another question. I think we are missing an opportunity to work with the river restoration community. Have you looked at projects involving floodplain reconnection, for example?
So it's not so much, we're not always very keen on floodplain reconnection because of the water quality of the rivers. And in fact, if you look up the Pink Hill demo sites, and there's some papers about the Pink Hill Meadow wetland, which is actually in the RRC, the River Restoration Center handbook. There are other examples of this, but we do actually work on floodplain a lot, but we don't necessarily want dirty water to go into our nice clean water ponds, because that's not going to be great for wildlife. Birds will be less fast, but certainly for wetland plants, sensitive wetland plants and animals, that's not going to be any good. So once we've cleared up the rivers or streams, then by all means, connect away. But until then, I think we need to be slightly careful.
Yeah.
Hello, Tristan.
Pascale, can I come to you? So I like.
Oh, you very. You're very intermittent, Tristan. I can't hear you properly.
Okay.
That's better.
Is that better?
Yeah, much better.
Okay. I feel a little bit like that response is.
Oh, sorry, I can't hear you anymore. Sorry, Tristan. Perhaps we can take this conversation offline and with a different medium, because you are now frozen.
Yeah, I think we lost him. Well, maybe I can do another question until he returns. Joseph, for instance, asked, you gave many examples associated with the abundance of groundwater sources or clay substrates that holds the rainwater, but that are quite rare in other regions. So what type of linear or underlinear protection would you suggest?
Liners, you mean? Yeah,
yes.
liners, yeah. Well, a good one, because liners don't last forever. There's a long time I haven't done the line pond. I thought my garden ponds, so I'm probably not the best person to talk to. But by and large, there's a kind of plastic liners, and then there's clay, like bentonites and bentomat and things like that. We've experimented a little bit with bentomat, but not massively. So again, I'm not the right person to get some proper advice on this.
Okay. Martin here asks, how does the lack of CO3 affect biodiversity? So calcium, I think, CO3 affects biodiversity.
Oh, CO3.
Yeah.
Well, it's one of the really important, how would you say, kind of influence on the water environment. Of course, it will make a massive difference to the pH. But it's not necessarily something we consider in terms of pond creation, because we want ponds of all type, acid ponds, alkaline ponds. So for me, it doesn't really matter what the pH is. as long as the water is clean and it is a right landscape for ponds, then it doesn't really matter. But generally, more alkaline ponds will be richer in terms of diversity, but then the more acid ponds will have specialist species. So all types of ponds are valuable. I certainly wouldn't try and change the water chemistry. I would work with the natural water chemistry of the water source you have access to.
Okay. And how about to deal with invasive species?
Yeah, yes, invasive species. Well, they're hard to deal with. That's why they're invasive. It's very hard. And what we try and do, because we go back to particularly the more recent ponds we've done, we have the luxury of being able to go back to them. The idea really when you create these water bodies is to, that's what I was saying about aftercare and monitoring, to actually try and catch those species as they arrive. But what we try and do is not to create ponds in areas where you have non-native invasive. So but it depends on which species. So if you had Himalayan balsam, for example, might be a little bit, more flexible if the ponds would really benefit wildlife. But if there's crassula on site, the New Zealand pygmy weeds, then that's probably a deal breaker, because extending the habitat for the species, which will directly benefit as opposed to Himalayan balsam, that will grow anyway because it grows on just mud. Crassula can grow on mud as well, but will benefit more from the habitat. So we tend to look at it on a side-by-side basis, but we do assess as part of our selection criteria whether a site has non-native invasive as part of the planning of the scheme. Yeah. But there's some species there's not much you can do about, really. And so, you have to decide what is best, to give another habitat for the invasive or not to give a habitat for natives. It can be tricky. It can be tricky unless you get away from urban areas and areas where there's a lot of people, because that's usually also where you find the non-native invasive.
Yeah. Here, Angela asked, I tend to work within the domestic large arena. Are there any current initiatives or even grants to join up domestic garden ponds? I'm not talking small ornamental ponds, but typical a minimum of 25-50 square meters. And often clients have adjoining land. Thank you.
Yes. So, garden ponds can really contribute as well in urban areas. And as you said, there is garden pond. There's the bucket in the middle of London, and then there's edge of urban where, particularly where you're close to existing historic wetlands or very high quality sites, garden ponds can support really good wildlife as well. So I would definitely encourage people to make ponds. Unfortunately, again, in my knowledge, there's no sources of funding for it. It's actually one of my little retiring fantasy to actually get all my neighbors around my area to create garden ponds. I'm the only one with garden ponds at the moment, but I don't know any source of funding to do those. Although, no, I'm not going to say it because I don't know if he's still there, and I don't want to send lots of people to this organization. I would look online. That's all I can say at this stage. But I don't know of any source of funding at this point.
Miguel from Portugal asks if there is any online guide on how to cultivate European aquatic plants for ponds. I can say that in Portugal there is nothing like that. Do you know for any other region?
No, that I know of. I'd be very surprised if it does exist. The Freshwater Habitats Trust actually is working on growing rare species with a view to reintroduce them to sites, existing and new sites. It's called Grow Wets. So by all means, have a look on the website for Grow Wets. And we are working with volunteers to try and raise awareness of the importance of these plants. Like I said, so often I talk to landowners and they don't say plants, they say weeds. And I really try and explain to them that the plants are so important. They are beautiful in their right, but of course, it depends how you see things. So yes, we've been doing grow wet for a couple of years, and it's not completely straightforward if you want to do a large amount of plants. But really, what we're trying to do is to grow these plants to try and protect those declining species that only have, you know, a handful of populations and potentially are looking at extinction. So we're trying to save those populations from extinction by collecting seeds and then growing them.
Yeah. Well, I think I saw all the questions. I don't know if anyone wants to ask a question. You are free to unmute your mics and ask if you want. Pascale, there are a lot of comments in the chat saying that it was a wonderful presentation.
Good. I hope I've inspired people to go and think about pond creation and make some. Please make some. I can't say enough how satisfying it is to go back to these sites and to see what lives there a few years later. You know, then they're not all perfect, of course. And there's some places that have turned up nicer than others. But if you put just the simple ingredients of clean water and the right place, then it will be an amazing wildlife habitat.
Yeah. We have just one more question that asks if there is a way for local groups to work with Freshwater Habitat Trust to build more ponds.
So at this point, we are always developing new projects, I would say. At this particular point in time, we don't have any community projects that are practical other than the grow wets, and we have some citizen science kind of survey type project. So at this point, no, but you never know, because like I said, we're always developing new projects, and if there was a need, if people were really interested in training courses and things like that, then like I said, there's a lot of information online already, but that could be something perhaps that we could develop in the future.
Yeah. Also, people are asking how can they get the clean water kits?
Yes. We don't actually supply those anymore, I don't think. We used to as part of the project. I think if you email info@Freshwater Habitats Trust, please don't all do it, because I will be very unpopular with my colleagues. But if you really have a significant project using lots of kits, so we don't sell individual kits, but we do every so often do orders. And if you had a project that could really use them in large enough numbers, then perhaps that's something we'd consider including you in our next order. But please don't quote me on this. This is not recorded. Yes, it's recorded. Damn.
I can add it. I can add it.
Delete that bit. Delete that bit.
Okay, so another question. There are any kits for the citrate available? Or funding for the citrate,
chytrids?
The chytrid, yes. I think so. The fungus,
amphibian disease.
Yeah, the amphibian, yeah.
Yes, no. So you probably need to look at herpetological organization. I think it's a zoological society that provides those, that has a program on this. So again, I would look online. We don't actually work directly with chytrids, although of course we apply biosecurity when we do surveys and site visits and so on.
Okay, perfect.
Okay.
I think it's all. Pascale, thank you very much. And thank you all for attending. As Pascale said, in next year we will have the technical handbook from Ponderful Project. Please stay in touch, follow us on social media, go to our website. We have also a newsletter twice a year. So there you can find more information. And if you want to see again this webinar, this will be on our YouTube channel. Just search for Ponderful or go to our website that is there as well. So thank you very much, and I hope to see you all next year in other webinars. Bye.
Okay.
Have a great weekend if that's the case for you.
Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you very much.